So if you look at verse 17, in chapter 2 of Genesis, it says, "But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, thou shalt not eat of it, for in the day that thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die." So a couple of pages into the Bible, we see something really, really vital. We see God say to the man, look, don't eat of this particular tree, because the day that you eat of that tree, you're surely going to die. And what happens subsequently as you continue on with the narrative is the man and the woman eventually eat the fruit. Okay, and then some people reading the narrative look at it and they say, well, hold on. God said in verse 17 of chapter 2, in that day you eat of the fruit, you shall surely die. But the man and woman didn't just physically drop dead there and then. So isn't God contradicting himself, or what's actually going on there? Now, if you look at it from a loose perspective, you might read this and think to yourself, oh, hold on, you know what, the Bible's contradicting itself. But if you actually look throughout the text, there's a couple of key variables that we can unpack which actually tell us exactly what's going on. Let me explain. First, you need to understand that man at this point, before eating of this particular tree, were actually immortal. So what does that mean? This basically means that man and woman were going to be living on the earth and they weren't going to die. As you study and read through the rest of the scriptures, you're going to get more insights into what we commonly known as sin. And sin is the big problem here, okay? The moment you sin against God, at that particular moment, you become someone who is unclean and is destined to die physically, a physical death. So if you think about it from the spectrum of immortality, let's say, for example, someone is immortal, okay? At the very moment they ate that fruit, their immortality evaporated. So even looking at this from a very loose form, you can see that going from immortality to at some point having a finite date in a moment is actually you physically dying one way, shape or form. So if you think about immortality as we kind of understand it in our finite minds, we think about it as loads and loads of time. Well, in fact, immortality is being outside of the time. So you're not in some linear sort of sequence here. We're going from left to right. You're actually outside of this. But what actually happened the moment they ate the fruit is life became finite. There was a designated end goal now where man and woman would actually die. Okay, that's the first variable. You see, and the next variable is also as impactful and something we see later on in the scriptures. When we get to the 90th Psalm, when we look at 2 Peter 3 in the New Testament, you see something really powerful from Moses, who wrote this psalm, and from Peter, the apostle. He basically talks about how one day with the Lord is equals to 1,000 years. And Moses even goes further in Psalm chapter 90 to talk about how it's even just like a watch in the night, which is equal to 3 hours in the night time. So as we've already explained already, there was a real physical component, okay, going from immortality to mortality the moment they ate their fruit. But at the same time, God knowing that people would look at this and say, well, how does this compute, etc. There's two other places in the scripture that give us this insights into what's actually going on here. And how do we know that these scriptures here actually apply? Well, when you get to Genesis 5, we see something really, really powerful. Some people look at this Genesis 5 family tree as some abstract, irrelevant family tree. But there's actually a couple of key things that we learn from that chapter. But one thing we're going to focus on in that is we get the family tree of people here. And one thing you should identify in that family tree is everyone is less than 1,000 years old. So when you know what God said here, and you know that man went from immortality into mortality by eating that fruit on that very specific day, they actually did physically die based on the sin. And then we focus on Psalms chapter 90 and 2 Peter chapter 3, we see that the way God looks at it from his standpoint is you can easily class one day in our time as 1,000 years, even as 3 hours in the night time. So that's why when we get to Genesis 5, we can see that everyone died before they were 1,000 years old. And in Genesis chapter 5, we get insights into the oldest man who ever lived. And I'm going to recommend you watch this video right here where we break it down in under a minute.